January 17, 1945. Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The snow fell in silence. Not the gentle silence of a winter's eve, but the suffocating quiet that comes when the earth itself holds its breath. Along a 3-kilometer defensive line carved into the frozen ridges east of the Roh River, soldiers of the 272nd Volksgrenadier Regiment crouched in their bunkers, their breath forming clouds in the darkness. They had been told this forest was impregnable. They had been told the Americans would break themselves against these positions like waves against stone. In the pre-dawn cold of that January morning, with frosts clinging to every surface and the smell of pine and cordite hanging in the air, they believed it. These were not the green conscripts of 1944. These were veterans who had held Normandy longer than anyone expected, who had counterattacked at Mortain, who had survived the Falaise Gap. They knew war. They knew fear. But they also knew their bunkers were deep, their fields of fire were clear, and behind them lay the fatherland itself. At precisely 0530 hours, the world ended. Not with a single shell, but with thousands. The American artillery barrage that opened that morning was not designed to soften resistance. It was designed to obliterate the very concept of resistance. From positions stretching across 15 kilometers of front, 420 guns opened fire simultaneously. Howitzers, long toms, and the dreaded 8-inch guns that the Germans called the express trains, for the sound they made tearing through the sky. The earth did not shake, it convulsed. Trees that had stood for centuries were sheared off at their trunks. Bunkers built with 3 feet of timber and earth vanished in single direct hits. Men who had survived Stalingrad, who had walked out of encirclements that killed divisions, found themselves reduced to children, curled in fetal positions at the bottom of collapsing holes, praying to gods they had long ago stopped believing in. The 272nd Volksgrenadier Regiment had been formed in September 1944 from the remnants of the shattered 272nd Infantry Division, rebuilt with a corps of Eastern Front survivors and fleshed out with Luftwaffe ground personnel and naval ratings who suddenly found themselves carrying rifles instead of servicing aircraft or manning coastal guns. Their commander, Oberst Heinrich Weibig, was a veteran of the First War and this one, a man who wore his Knight's Cross with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned it in the snows outside Moscow. He had positioned his men with the precision of a craftsman. Every approach was covered. Every bunker was mutually supporting. The forest itself was the ally, dense, dark, channeling any attacker into predetermined killing zones. In late December, they had repulsed 2 American probing attacks, inflicting casualties at a ratio of 3-1. Weibig had sent a message to division headquarters that was read aloud to visiting staff officers. "The Americans have courage but no imagination. They attack where we are strongest and withdraw where we are weakest. Give me ammunition and they will never cross the Rohr." The Americans had read that intercept. They took it personally. What the 272nd did not understand, what no German formation on the Western Front truly understood in those final months, was that they were no longer fighting a conventional war. They were fighting an industrial apocalypse. The United States Army in Europe in January 1945 possessed more artillery tubes than the entire German military had fielded in 1939. More shells were expended in single preparatory barrages than the Kaiser's armies had fired in entire offensives during the Great War. An American infantry division in 1945 had more organic firepower than a German corps. And behind those divisions was a supply system so vast, so incomprehensibly abundant, that frontline units complained not about shortages but about having to dig additional storage for excess ammunition. The barrage that struck the 272nd that morning was not an improvisation. It was a symphony composed over 3 weeks by the artillery staff of the 9th Infantry Division, coordinated with corps-level assets, and timed to the second. The first wave was high explosive, designed to strip away camouflage and destroy surface structures. The second wave, beginning 15 minutes later, was variable time proximity fuses, shells that detonated 30 feet above the ground, spraying shrapnel downward into trenches and foxholes with surgical efficiency. The third wave was white phosphorus, marking targets and igniting anything that could burn. The fourth wave was more high explosive, this time focused on predetermined coordinates where German reserves were expected to assemble. There was no fifth wave because by then, after 90 minutes of continuous fire, the target area had ceased to exist as a military position. Lieutenant Franz Gardner, commanding the regiment's 7th Company, had written a letter to his wife the night before the barrage. It was found later, unsent, in the pocket of his tunic when his body was recovered 3 days afterward. "We are ready," he had written. "The Americans are brave but wasteful. They spend shells like millionaires spending coins, never thinking of tomorrow. We husband our resources. We make every bullet count. This is why we will prevail, not because we are stronger, but because we are wiser." The letter stopped mid-sentence. Perhaps he had been called to inspect the lines. Perhaps he had simply fallen asleep. The irony would have been lost on him had he lived to finish it. The Americans were not being wasteful. They were being thorough. There is a difference. When the barrage lifted at 0700 hours, the silence returned, but it was different now. This was the silence of erasure. Where there had been a forest, there were now stumps and splinters. Where there had been bunkers, there were craters. Where there had been men, there were fragments that defied identification. The American infantry advanced behind a creeping barrage, their own artillery continuing to fire just 200 meters ahead of them, forcing any surviving defenders to remain underground until the attackers were literally on top of their positions. It was a tactic the Germans had pioneered in 1918. Now it was being used against them with a precision and weight of fire they had never imagined possible. The Germans who survived that first barrage, and there were survivors, because there are always survivors, emerged into a landscape that bore no resemblance to the positions they had occupied hours before. Feldwebel Otto Kraus, a squad leader in the 9th Company, would later tell interrogators that the first thing he noticed was the smell. Not cordite or smoke, but coffee. The Americans were so close he could smell their breakfast coffee. The second thing he noticed was the sound, or rather, the absence of it. No birds. No wind in the trees because there were no trees. Just the crunch of boots on snow and the metallic clicking of American rifles being readied. His MG-42 machine gun, the weapon he had lovingly maintained through 2 years of combat, had been buried under 3 feet of earth when his bunker collapsed. His squad of 9 men was now 3, and one of those was deaf from the concussion. They did not fight. They could not fight. They surrendered to an 18-year-old private from Nebraska who accepted their weapons with the casual indifference of someone collecting tickets at a cinema. But the barrage did not end with the infantry assault. That was merely the beginning. For 72 hours, the American artillery hammered every identified German position, every crossroads, every suspected assembly area, every conceivable route of reinforcement or withdrawal. Shells fell with metronomic regularity, not random harassment, but calculated interdiction. German relief columns attempting to reach the 272nd found themselves walking into predetermined killing zones where every intersection had been registered, every approach zeroed. A battalion of the 89th Infantry Division, ordered to counterattack and restore the line, lost 2 companies before they even made contact with the enemy. They were simply deleted from existence by artillery fire directed by forward observers who could call down a battalion-level fire mission the way a man might order lunch. The 272nd had expected a battle. They had prepared for a battle. What they received was not a battle but an execution, and the method of execution was mathematics. Every shell was accounted for. Every grid coordinate was verified. Every fire mission was logged and evaluated for effectiveness. The Americans had turned warfare into accountancy, and the balance sheet was written in high explosive and steel. A German regimental headquarters that had withstood 3 months of combat ceased to exist 17 minutes after its radio transmissions were triangulated. A company command post that had survived the initial barrage was obliterated when a forward observer spotted the antenna of its field telephone protruding from the rubble. The Americans were not just fighting. They were racing. In the German defensive doctrine, artillery was a supporting arm, important, certainly, but subordinate to the infantry and armor that did the actual fighting. In the American doctrine, Artillery was the primary killing arm and everything else existed to enable it or exploit its effects. This was not a subtle difference. It was a fundamental philosophical divergence about the nature of industrial warfare. The Germans still thought of war as a contest between soldiers. The Americans had realized it was a contest between economies, and they had brought their economy to the battlefield in the form of shells. So many shells that quartermasters complained about the logistics of moving them forward. So many shells that the barrels of the guns had to be replaced every 3 days because they literally wore out from firing. So many shells that German survivors, when questioned, could not provide accurate estimates of what had hit them because the concept of counting had become meaningless. Among the Americans firing those shells was a young lieutenant named Robert Morrison, a former mathematics teacher from Ohio who had volunteered in 1942 and found himself commanding a battery of 105 mm howitzers. He kept a diary, against regulations, because he could not quite believe what he was witnessing and wanted to record it for posterity. His entry for January 17, 1945 reads, "Fired 1,847 rounds today. That's more than my grandfather's entire artillery regiment fired in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. We did it before lunch. The guns are so hot you can't touch them. The crews work with wet blankets over the barrels between fire missions. No one complains. Everyone knows what we're doing. We're burying them. Not killing them, burying them. There's a difference." There was indeed a difference, and the Germans of the 272nd were learning it. Not through briefings or intelligence reports, but through the visceral experience of having every assumption about warfare inverted. They had been taught that courage mattered, that discipline mattered, that tactical skill mattered. And those things did matter, against an enemy who shared your resource constraints. Against an enemy who measured ammunition expenditure in shells per gun per day rather than per week. Against an enemy who treated artillery the way you treated rifle bullets. But against an enemy who could fire more shells in an afternoon than your entire division had been allocated for a month? Courage became irrelevant. Discipline became a liability, keeping men in positions that had become graves. Tactical skill became a cruel joke when every tactically sound decision led to the same result: annihilation by fire before you ever saw the enemy. By the end of the first day, the 272nd Volksgrenadier Regiment had ceased to exist as a coherent military formation. Individual companies were out of contact with battalion headquarters. Battalions could not reach the regiment. The regiment could not communicate with division. The forest that was supposed to protect them had become a prison, channeling them into ravines and draws that had all been pre-registered as target areas. Survivors huddled in shell craters, because the craters were the only cover remaining, not realizing that American doctrine called for rebombardment of cratered areas on the assumption that enemy troops would do exactly that. When German artillery attempted to respond, their counter-battery fire was suppressed within minutes by American radar-directed fire that could trace an incoming shell back to its origin and drop a fire mission on that position before the gun crew could displace. It was not war. It was not even murder. It was something closer to natural disaster, impersonal, inevitable, and utterly indifferent to human courage or will. On the second day, the Americans began incorporating white phosphorus shells into the barrage at irregular intervals. White phosphorus burns at over 1500 degrees Fahrenheit and cannot be extinguished with water. It was officially designated for marking and screening, but everyone knew its real purpose. The Germans called it the Devil's Snow. When it rained down on positions that had been holding out, resistance collapsed almost immediately. Not because men were killed, though many were, but because white phosphorus strips away the last defense the human mind has against industrialized slaughter, the ability to believe you might survive if you just endure a little longer. No one endures white phosphorus. You run, or you die screaming, and running meant exposing yourself to the machine guns of the advancing American infantry. Oberst Weibig, the regimental commander who had promised his men would never be driven from their positions, was killed on the afternoon of the second day by a shell fragment that struck him as he attempted to move between his command bunker and an observation post. He was posthumously promoted and awarded the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross. The citation praised his stubborn defense in the face of overwhelming enemy firepower. It did not mention that overwhelming was an understatement, or that stubborn had simply meant keeping men in place long enough for the artillery to find them. His last order, transmitted by a runner because the radios were all dead, was to withdraw to secondary positions along the Ruhr. The runner was killed by artillery before he could deliver it. The regiment attempted to withdraw anyway, because by then there was nothing else to do. Half of them died in the attempt, caught in the open by shells that seemed to anticipate their every movement. By the third day, the artillery fire had tapered to merely 500 shells per hour across the former regimental sector, a rate that would have constituted a major barrage in any previous war but now represented a lull. American patrols moved through the wreckage, occasionally exchanging fire with isolated holdouts, but mostly just processing prisoners and marking the locations of the dead for graves registration. A chaplain with the 9th Infantry Division noted in his report that the German dead they found were remarkably young or remarkably old, with few men of military prime. This was the Wehrmacht of 1945, teenagers and grandfathers, led by a dwindling cadre of veterans who had somehow survived everything the war had thrown at them until now. Until the shells came. The shells did not care about experience or valor. The shells were democratic in their lethality, and there were always more shells. When the survivors of the 272nd were tallied, the regiment that had gone into the line with approximately 2,800 men could muster fewer than 400 for roll call. The rest were dead, wounded, captured, or simply missing, vaporized, buried, scattered into fragments too small to identify. German division headquarters initially listed them as temporarily combat ineffective, before revising the designation to destroyed. The regiment would be rebuilt twice more before the war ended, each iteration weaker than the last, until the final version surrendered in the Ruhr pocket with a strength of 90 men commanded by a captain. But the real 272nd, the confident, veteran formation that had held the Hürtgen Forest and promised to throw the Americans back, died in those 72 hours in January. It died not in glorious last stands or heroic charges, but buried under steel and high explosive, methodically erased by an enemy that possessed the one advantage that trumps all others in industrial warfare: enough. The symbolic legacy of that barrage was not in any particular tactical innovation or operational breakthrough. The Allies had already won the war by January 1945. Everyone with access to casualty reports and production figures knew it. The legacy was in what it represented about the final evolution of warfare in the industrial age. The 272nd had prepared for a fight between soldiers. They had received a fight between economies, and the American economy had manifested itself on that frozen German hillside in the form of shells. Endless, inevitable shells. A German soldier could train for years, could hone his skills and courage to perfection, could deploy to ideal terrain and well-constructed fortifications, and none of it mattered if the enemy could afford to simply delete the ground you were standing on. In the years after the war, military historians would study the Hürtgen Forest campaign and debate its tactical and operational merits. Some would call it a meat grinder, a wasteful frontal assault against prepared defenses that cost the Americans dearly. Others would point to battles like the destruction of the 272nd and note that by early 1945, the Americans had learned to leverage their material advantage so thoroughly that meat grinders became obsolete. You did not need to grind the enemy when you could bury them. The debate would miss the larger point. The 272nd did not lose because their tactics were faulty, or their soldiers were cowards. They lost because they were fighting the war they had prepared for while their enemy was fighting the war that logistics made possible. The Americans had brought industrial civilization to the battlefield, and industrial civilization does not negotiate or accept tactical draws. It simply produces more shells, more guns, more tonnage, until the problem is solved. There were no grand last words from the men of the 272nd, no dramatic pronouncements for the history books. Just the scattered recollections of survivors who spoke, when they spoke at all, of the noise and the fear and the absolute helplessness of being subject to forces beyond human scale. One Gefreiter, interviewed decades later, said simply, They had everything. We had nothing. Not nothing like we were out of ammunition, we had ammunition. Nothing like it didn't matter what we had. They could erase us, and we could not erase them, and so we were erased. Another survivor, asked what had broken the regiment's will to fight, laughed bitterly and said, "Will?" After the second day, there was no will, no not will. There was just waiting to see if the next shell had your name on it. And they had enough shells to put every man's name on one. The snow that had fallen on January 17th was still white that morning, pristine and clean. By January 20th, when the guns finally fell silent, the snow across the 272 ND's former positions was churned into gray-brown mud mixed with splinters and steel fragments, and things that were better not identified. The forest that had been their fortress had become their grave marker. And somewhere in the supply depots behind the American lines, quartermasters were already calculating how many shells would be needed for the next barrage, the next objective, the next enemy formation that did not yet understand what it meant to fight not just an army, but an economy that had decided you no longer served a purpose. This is what the final year of the Second World War looked like for Germany, not defeat in glorious battle, but deletion by mathematics. The 272nd Volksgrenadier Regiment learned that truth across 72 hours in January. They learned it in the language that industrial warfare speaks: fluent, steel and high explosive and overwhelming, impersonal force. They learned it, and then most of them died, and the guns moved on to the next grid coordinate, the next target, the next unit that still believed preparation and courage and tactical skill could overcome the fundamental imbalance of resources. The Americans had not just brought more shells to the battle. They had brought a different conception of what battle could be, not a contest between fighters, but a problem to be solved through the application of sufficient firepower. And in January 1945, in a frozen forest east of the Roe River, that problem was solved. 72 hours. 400 guns. The 272nd Volksgrenadier Regiment. Solved.